Welcome to Dialogue. I'm Yang Rui in Beijing. 23 years after the Cold War, policies, actions, and even reform of the United Nations still make headlines. Enslaved by traditional norms of nation-state politics, how do we look at issues of human rights and especially political uncertainty in changing societies? Today, I feel quite happy to discuss issues of POW rights, the dignity of refugees, and the representation of 193 member states of the United Nations. And also, we need to go to great lengths discussing the roles of both the biggest and the second biggest economies in carrying out the mandate of the United Nations. Before we start the interview with Mr. LAMIN Ceesay, Senior International Consultant for Mr. Kofi Annan, former UN Chief, let's take a quick look at this.
Today is the 66th anniversary of Human Rights Day. On December 10th of every year, Human Rights Day commemorates the date when the United Nations adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, proclaiming its principles as the common standard of achievement for all peoples and all nations. This year's slogan, Human Rights 365, encompasses the idea that every day is Human Rights Day. The number and scale of global humanitarian agencies are breaking all sorts of records this year. The UN asked for $12.9 billion to assist 52 million people. But during 2014, the number of people in need has nearly doubled to a record 102 million. Among all the conflicts and natural disasters, one of the biggest challenges is the Ebola crisis. The wave of the Ebola outbreak, which began in March, is the most severe and most complex in the nearly 50-year history of the disease. According to the World Health Organization, over 17,000 people have been infected by the virus and over 6,000 have died. And the case incidence is still increasing in Kenya and may also be increasing in Sierra Leone.
And that keeps us very focused and sometimes quite anxious. Every day we wake up and we realize the enormity of the job that still lies ahead.
China and the United Nations signed an agreement on a Chinese donation of $6 million to aid the global fight against Ebola last Tuesday. The move is part of China's fourth round of Ebola fighting aid announced earlier by President Xi Jinping.
Welcome to Dialogue, sir.
Thank you very much.
Kofi Annan is a big name. What are the things that impress you most about his charisma and legacy?
Mr. Annan is a unique leader who came into the organization head at a very critical moment. His legacy involves includes the bringing of the United Nations to the people, changing the culture of focusing only on a government-centered institution. If you look at the preamble part of the charter of the organization, it talks about we the peoples, determined to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war. I think to a great extent the legacy is in that area, bringing this institution to the peoples, involving private sector, involving civil society organizations. And that, to a great extent, would be his legacy of getting the organization out and bringing it to the people, making it meaningful.
When Kofi Annan said human rights know no boundaries, it means it could universally accepted no matter what, regardless of the national conditions. Now, what do you think of the issue of human rights, which is of course, one major aspect of Kofi Annan's legacy?
Human rights is at the center of the United Nations. It has to be. It's difficult to imagine a system, any system around, that ignores the centrality of human rights in our own existence as human beings, not just the institution of the UN.
But what's your definition of human rights?
The right to be free, the right the rights that are spelled out in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. They are standards that societies must really strive to attain. Promoting it, protecting it, respecting it are all things that I think should be fundamental to the issue of human rights.
But the United Nations serves to bridge different cultures, introducing the culture of diversity as opposed to harmony. In Chinese, we say 和而不同, we are different, but we try to seek a commonality. With that at the back of our mind, what do you think of, say, the cultural diversity and different cultural definition about human rights? Because it's somehow dangerous to apply universal standard, particularly in political domains.
Well, diversity and universality are not necessarily contradictory. In the context of my human rights, that you pose the question. At the end of the day, in my view, diversity is an asset. It shows the difference that we have in our cultures, in our civilizations, different times as well. But that diversity really, at the end of the day, makes us, gives us strength in supporting that universal aspect of our lives. I think, as I said, the universality is dealing with human beings at the end of the day. Well, however diverse we may be, we are all human beings. We all have rights and things that should be respected, promoted, and protected.
My questions go back to another part of human rights, that's POW, prisoners of war. We have had 4 UN conventions which were formulated back in 1949. Do you think those universal norms about respecting the rights of the POWs remain respected in many cases, like in areas of conflict, since 1949?
Well, the POW Convention was a recognition, like other conventions relating to to armed conflict, that we cannot, if we cannot go ahead and abolish war, prohibit war, we should find a way of regulating it. The 4 conventions I talked about, the 1949 4 Geneva Conventions, the first one dealing with armed conflict on land, the second dealing with armed conflict at sea, and the third one that you referred to, the Prisoners of War Convention, and the 4th one on the Civilians Convention, was really to regulate armed conflict, to find a way of reducing suffering, reducing devastation, and those crimes also that were really committed during the Second World War, that we address these issues under the general rubric of the conventions.
What about the issue of refugees? Millions of them have been left homeless internally and externally due to one regional conflict after another, and also some of them were triggered by ethnic conflicts and religious disputes.
Again, many of these issues that came up during the Second World War, we did see refugees streaming across borders.
So what about the 4 Middle East wars and Iran-Iraq war,
Yeah.
Iraqi refugees in Afghanistan?
All that.
In 2001?
There is a refugees convention, 1951, that deals with the status of refugees, protection of these. Again, here we are. There is a situation that we cannot stop. You cannot abolish it. You must regulate it. You must protect these individuals. And that's where these rules have emerged. And as I said, the Second World War gave rise to many of these rules that have become very central in international law. There is a Refugees Convention protecting them. fine, it started from that period, but it covers all these subsequent refugee situations that you talked about.
And part of the catch-22 situation between Israelis and Palestinians in the Middle East, I'm afraid, is the return of thousands upon thousands of Palestinian refugees to where they lived, to where their fathers and grandfathers lived in the Middle East, plus the future of Jerusalem and the 1967 border control. Well, do you foresee any solution to the dilemma here?
Do I foresee a solution? I'm hoping for a solution in the area. What is happening now, clearly, is making the challenge even more difficult for that to happen. Refugees do have right of return. Are we talking about that happening in the area? Is there a possibility of that succeeding? I'm hopeful that a way is found to address the refugee situation. Clearly, people who have been living in camps in that situation for decades, it's not an easy thing for them. They clearly would not have confidence in the system that has been established, ensuring the return, the end of conflict, of people getting back to their homes.
Back to the policy of Kofi Annan in those days, was he able to deal with both sides, Tel Aviv and the Palestinians, in a fair way? Because it's very difficult even for the U.S. To play to both sides.
Difficult for everybody, yes indeed. But the important thing is, did he have the confidence of both sides to allow him to do what he could do as Secretary General of the United Nations? That was one of his assets again, that he's able to gain the confidence of the sides, different sides to a conflict, to allow him to do his, to carry out his responsibilities as Secretary General of the United Nations.
We've had dozens of UN Security Council resolutions. Not all of them have the legal binding powers. Therefore, do you think it's very difficult for the UN chief to carry out the mandate?
The Security Council resolutions are binding. Is the Assembly resolutions passed.
But it doesn't have the force and powers to enforce resolutions
in the area. Where, if it is undertaken, the Chapter 7, that's under the enforcement article in the Charter. Yes, indeed. That is, there are times when the Council's own responsibilities, perhaps or definitions or mandates that it gives them under that Chapter 7 may fall short of effective action to be taken to address a particular situation. We have seen situations also where you have even armed conflict, war going on, and the issue not even coming to the Council. Vietnam was one. The Vietnam issue never came to the Security Council. There are difficulties where perhaps permanent members involved in certain conflicts would make sure that those issues don't come to the Council. Or if they come to the Council, they face the veto.
What do you think of the issue of proper representation of Africans in the UN Security Council? That should be looked at in the context of reform of the United Nations. Its enlargement, almost 70 years after the end of the Second World War.
The reform of the Security Council has been debated for quite some time now. It's been going on. The last time that they did anything concerning reform was perhaps the expansion of the membership of the Security Council. In 1965, when it was expanded from 11 members to 15 members. Expansion or the increase of permanent members, that has not been agreed to, and it can only come about when the 5 permanent members agree to that kind of reform of the Council.
What do you think of the issue of a veto? And veto seemed to have been abused during the Cold War by both superpowers. This time around, How do you look at the use of a veto?
Well, it goes back to the origins of the institution itself. If you look at the discussions at the Charter Conference in San Francisco in 1945, what the middle powers, they refer to them as middle powers at that time, were advocating is still the same thing that's coming on. The big powers are the ones who have this control, who have this power, who have the authority, and it may be abused. And as you said correctly, we have seen situations during the Cold War when it was flagrantly abused. And that has continued. But to reform that, you would have to get the concurrence of the 5 permanent members. That's what it is. There's a rule. And say what one can do is perhaps to talk about wise and judicious exercise of the veto. Find a way of reducing it to the barest minimum and see what needs to be done in that. The 53 African members of the African Union that you talked about, the only expansion, as I said, or the effect of that increase in African membership was the 1965 expansion of the Security Council from 11 to 15 members.
All right, thank you very much. We'll have to leave you there for the moment. You are watching Dialogue with Mr. LAMIN Ceesay, Senior International Consultant and Advisor to Mr. Kofi Annan, former Secretary General of the United Nations. We'll be back in a short while. Please stay with us. Welcome back.
Thank you.
What do you think of the role of the U.S. in guaranteeing the authority of the United Nations, or just the other way around?
The intervention in Iraq was not an easy one for the institution. You heard the remarks of the Secretary General at that time during the debate that it would have been better for those who were planning on intervening in Iraq to obtain the concurrence of the Security Council, endorsement of the Security Council. When they realized that this was not going to happen, they clearly thought that they need to do it unilaterally. We have seen the consequences of such unilateral action. We have seen how this has happened. Now, if you have disagreement in the Security Council, sometimes it can really lead them to catastrophic consequences. Again, we are seeing it today in Syria, where the organization is not able to intervene effectively to stop a devastating civil war. Hundreds of thousands of people killed, 200,000, and half of the population completely deracinated, internally displaced people all over the country, Syria, and outside in the neighboring countries, you have millions of refugees in camps in the neighboring countries, Lebanon, Jordan, and Turkey. Without any action from the Council, you're going to get that. How did that happen? You look at it. They were unanimous. They agreed to allow your intervention in Libya. How that turned out was what probably affected the situation in Syria. You will recall that the Libya situation, when Colonel Gaddafi threatened to attack the civilian population in Benghazi, and it about canals of blood flowing in Benghazi. He was taken seriously about that this was going to happen.
Some of the Europeans accuse China of practicing new colonialism, but China says, hey, wait a minute, we've been sparing no efforts in constructing infrastructure to benefit the local well-being, instead of likening it to the previous Western colonialism, very simple cutting of the borders leading to tribal rivalry. That's been going on and on for decades. What do you think of the impact of China's growing presence, economic and political perhaps, in Africa?
Well, if we live in Africa for centuries, 300-400 years under colonialism, under colonial rule, clearly we should recognize colonialism when we see it. The issue of what China is doing in the area, whether or not this is neo-colonialism or not, I think it's an issue for the continent really to decide what they're going to do. Are they going to strengthen their own side to be able to negotiate trade agreements, to be able to negotiate investment arrangements? If they are able to do that, I mean, it's for them to do that, I mean, to develop that system. I think it would have to be distinguished from a colonial thing. In the first place, those who are screaming, we've been there for 400 years and nothing happens. And now these guys are negotiating with a partner to carry out projects. It's for them to really negotiate effectively with the Chinese. The Africans would do that with the Chinese, not that. I don't think China is going there to say we're going to administer the countries. No. They're going there that if China wants the resources, the primary resources, the commodities from this area, let the Africans negotiate with that. Let them establish their terms and conditions for selling whatever they're going to do. That is not colonialism, in my view.
African countries north of sub-Saharan region or south of that line of the sub-region mostly are developing countries, and they face much the same challenge of maintaining law and order during the transformation, economic and social alike. But I'm talking about the risks we need to take into consideration when Chinese investment is about to go abroad. How shall we assess the local political risks without being singled out as a scapegoat in their partisan wrangling?
Well, as I said, I think it would have been, what is important is the power of the African countries to be able to sit and tell the Chinese what their conditions are. You have the power now to negotiate, which was not a colonial. I'm making a distinction between a colonial ruler and a partner coming, perhaps with conditions that end up not being what we wanted. But do you have the opportunity to ask or to say, look, these are the conditions that we want for our partnership. These are the conditions that we should labor. These are the this is the percentage that we think of labor, local labor that should be hired by an investor in the area. At least that power is there to negotiate with China to change what is causing difficulties, rather than a colonial power that comes in and then is only telling you what they want.
The last question is very much about where you come from. You come from West Africa, where we saw the outbreak of Ebola. China sent over 300 medical workers there to help assist with the rescue relief campaign. Now, what's the progress? So tell us more about the development there.
I believe the reaction is picking up very much to try to see whether or not more treatment centers could be established in the three hardest hit countries: Guinea, Sierra Leone, and Liberia. The international community and perhaps even the local governments were a bit slow when this thing started, when the epidemic started. There were screams for help. Médecins Sans Frontières with MSF has been asking for help. They are going to be overwhelmed by the magnitude of the. It's somewhat stabilized, as I understand it today, as of today, in Sierra Leone and in Liberia and Guinea. The new cases, the report of new cases coming, the rate has gone down. Sierra Leone is a bit of a challenge still, and see what it is. The impact of the epidemic in the three countries, the economies of the three countries, is devastating. The vast majority of the people in the rural areas are farmers. And not to be able to go to the fields to till the land, do what they need to do. Borders have been closed. That has had a negative effect on trade as well. So all these things are really going on. In some areas, even schools have been closed. The impact on the economies of the three countries is really going to be massive. One would have to wait and see at the end of the day what, in terms of statistics, this devastation really has been.
Obviously, China needs to do more to help with our African brothers and sisters. Thank you for being with us on this edition of Dialogue. I really appreciate it. Thanks.
Thank you very much.